So, the killer shark. As a concept, it makes a lot of sense. According to paleontologists, sharks have been around for 400 million years, and barring a few exceptions, they have barely changed at all since. They are the perfect ocean predator. As if that wasn't bad enough, if you find yourself in danger from a shark, then chances are that you are either in the water or on the water, where every advantage lies with the fish. You are literally out of your element. Now, Jaws is by no means the first successful killer shark movie. That honor belongs to the 1950 film Killer Shark. Okay. But Jaws is undeniably the most successful and the most definitive. It has made people afraid to go back in the water. It has inspired several lousy sequels and countless cash grabs. And to think that it was all made possible by a literal starving author and a young director eager to prove himself. Naturally, this raises a few questions. Why was this particular book the one chosen to be adapted? What was it about this particular film that made it so definitive, that made sharks such an iconic movie monster and launched the career of one of Hollywood's most celebrated directors? Why do we care about Jaws? Behind every great story is an origin story, and Jaws is no exception to this rule. Peter Benchley was a writer from a family of writers, but by the 1970s, he was mostly doing odd jobs, struggling to support his wife and children. In 1971, Benchley resolved to, as he put it, make one final attempt to make a living as a writer. Through his literary agent, he pitched two ideas to various publishers. One, a non-fiction book about pirates, and two, a fictional story about a man-eating shark. The shark idea was picked up by the editor of Doubleday Publishing, and Jaws first appeared on the bookshelves in 1974. And it became so successful that it managed to stay on the bestseller list for 44 weeks straight. So naturally, Hollywood decided to make a movie out of it. They gave the job to a young and up-and-coming fellow by the name of Steven Spielberg. The movie premiered in 1975, made over $100 million, became the first summer blockbuster, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, aside from the fact that I'm doing the book first, then the film, the reasons that I'm about to list are in no particular order, merely as they occurred to me. With that said, let's begin. For a book that's over 270 pages long, Jaws is extremely well-paced. At least insofar as the main plot is concerned. There is one subplot that does sort of slow it down before the shark hunt begins, but I'll have to address that when I get to the film. Aside from that, the story remains well-paced and engaging even before we finally get aboard the orca with the characters. How engaging, you ask? Well, you know how in the film the shark hunt doesn't actually occur until halfway through the movie? Well, in the book, the actual shark hunt is less than a third of the total story. I don't know about you, but that's impressive. Next. Much like its film adaptation, Jaws the book is very, very good at building suspense. In many ways, suspense is what makes a good killer shark story. Because the shark is an aquatic creature, it combines the fear of the unknown, not knowing where it is or when it might strike, with a feeling of powerlessness that most people aren't accustomed to when it comes to animals, as we've generally become secure in our technological dominance over nature. Unfortunately, trying to describe exactly how Peter Benchley was able to pull this off in his writing would take too long. So instead, I'm going to read a brief excerpt from the very beginning of the book describing the shark's first kill. The fish closed on the woman and hurtled past, 12 feet to the side and 6 feet below the surface. The woman felt only a wave of pressure that seemed to lift her up in the water and ease her down again. She stopped swimming and held her breath. Feeling nothing further, she resumed her lurching stroke. The fish smelled her now, and the vibrations, erratic and sharp, signaled distress. The fish began to circle close to the surface. Its dorsal fin broke water, and its tail, thrashing back and forth, cut the glassy surface with a hiss. A series of tremors shook its body. For the first time, the woman felt fear, though she did not know why. Adrenaline shot through her trunk and her limbs, generating a tingling heat and urging her to swim faster. She guessed that she was 50 yards from shore. She could see the line of white foam where the waves broke on the beach. She saw lights in the house, and for a comforting moment, she thought she saw someone pass by one of the windows. The fish was about 40 feet from the woman, off to the side, when it suddenly turned to the left, dropped entirely below the surface, and with 2 quick thrusts of its tail, was upon her. At first, the woman thought she had snagged her leg on a rock or a piece of floating wood. There was no initial pain, only one violent tug on her right leg. She reached down to touch her foot, treading water with her left leg to keep her head up, feeling in the blackness with her left hand. She could not find her foot. She reached higher on her leg, and then she was overcome by a rush of nausea and dizziness. Her groping fingers had found a nub of bone and tattered flesh. She knew that the warm, pulsing flow over her fingers in the chill water was her own blood. Now, I don't know about you, but that is good writing. Next. Since a book isn't bound by the same kind of time limitations as a film, there's a lot more room to expand upon your characters and get to know them better. And perhaps the character that has benefited most from this greater depth is Mayor Larry Vaughn. In the film, Vaughn is just a greedy politician, more concerned with Amity's economic status rather than the fact that people are getting killed, although he does come around by the middle of the film. Although it is brought up at least twice in the film, the book has far more room to expound on the fact that Amity is essentially a vacation town, heavily dependent on the tourist trade for its survival. So it's not just Vaughn and the town leaders, but many of the townspeople of Amity themselves that are reluctant to let Brody close the beaches after the first attack. It is later revealed by Amity's local newspaper editor, Harry Meadows, you might know him as the guy in the powder blue suit from the film, that Vaughn is also in debt to the mafia, and that they are pressuring him to keep the beaches open because they've invested a lot of their money in Amity real estate. In fact, in the book, a mobster drives up to the Brody household, grabs Brody's pet cat, and then breaks its neck in front of his son, as a message to Brody himself. As the book goes on, the combination of pressure from his mafia backers and the guilt over his actions and decisions causes Vaughn to become an alcoholic and waste away into a shadow of his former self. By the end of the story, he has left Amity for good along with his wife. The book in no way excuses Vaughn's actions, but by showing his deterioration over the course of the story, it does humanize him in a way a 2-hour film couldn't. Next. The first time I ever read Jaws was in preparation for this video, and as I read it, I began to have the sneaking suspicion that, like me, Peter Benchley was a fan of Moby Dick. This is especially true in the case of Quint. In the book, he is far more serious than his film counterpart, and the story he tells about surviving in shark-infested waters during the Pacific War is a film edition. But apart from that, both versions are roughly the same. A hard-bitten, salty old sailor who knows the water like the back of his hand, who is contemptuous of Hooper for his city boy upbringing. And as the shark continues to outsmart the trio, becomes obsessed with hunting it down for his own sake rather than just for his fee. This draws a rather obvious connection to Captain Ahab, who in his turn seeks to destroy another aquatic monster. But while in Ahab's case he's hunting the white whale for revenge, Quint's hunt is out of pride. No fish has ever outsmarted him before, and he's not about to let this shark be the first. And if you think that's too subtle of an analogy, the ending makes it obvious. Of course, in the film, Quint is killed and eaten by the shark. But in the book, while the shark is busy destroying the ship, one of Quint's feet gets tangled up in one of the ropes attached to the float buoys meant to prevent the shark from diving, and he is dragged into the water and drowned before Brody can cut the rope. After the shark is dead, Brody looks down into the water, and beside the dead shark, he sees the body of Quint, tangled up in the ropes, an obvious homage to Ahab's fate in Moby Dick. It just goes to show you that the classics never die. And speaking of the ending, although the book and film do end in roughly the same way, several important details are different. First of all, in the book, the shark kills Hooper, ramming the cage hard enough that it forces the bars apart so that it can get inside and bite him. Later, during the shark's attack on the boat, Quint and Brody manage to get in some good shots and stabs, but the shark seems completely indifferent to its wounds. By the end of the story, Quint is drowned, the ship has sunk, and Brody is left clinging to a single cushion to stay afloat, completely defenseless as the shark closes in for the final kill. And then, mere feet away from Brody, the shark literally stops dead, having finally succumbed to its wounds. Speaking as a book lover, I will confess to often suffering from what I like to call source material puritanism, a feeling of great resentment towards people who deviate from the original source material. Plus, having seen the film right after reading the book, I will confess that I find the book's ending to be far more suspenseful, if less action-packed, and I do kind of wish Spielberg would have been more faithful in adapting the ending. Still, we got what we got. And on that note, let's move on to reasons pertaining to Jaws the film. You remember how earlier in the video I talked about how the pacing of the book was really good except for one subplot that kind of dragged it down and that the film chose to omit? Well, for once, my inner source material Puritan actually concurs with Mr. Spielberg and agrees that the omission of this subplot was very much to the film's advantage. As best as I can briefly summarize it, the subplot kind of goes like this. See, before she got married, Ellen Brody came from a fairly well-off family, one of the summer people that visited Amity once a year. Though she did genuinely fall in love with Chief Brody, after the first few years of marital bliss, things started to go downhill for Ellen. Being the chief of police of a sleepy beachfront town doesn't pay very well. This, combined with the clannish reluctance of the Amity locals to accept outsiders into their ranks, left Ellen feeling isolated and pining for the affluent lifestyle that as a younger woman she had once derided as dull and stale. By the beginning of the book, she has already made several attempts to reconnect with her old social circles, all of which ended in failure and with Ellen venting her frustrations on her husband, which of course only made her feel guilty as well as unsatisfied. This frustrated desire to reclaim her youth ultimately leads Ellen Brody to having an affair with Matt Hooper. By the end of the story, however, she has come to terms with the futility of trying to relive the past and learns to appreciate the life that she has now. I can see why Spielberg chose to omit this from the film adaptation. Not only does it slow down the story, but in spite of Benchley's intentions that we should feel sympathy for Ellen Brody, I personally found it very difficult to do so. And not just because she commits adultery as a means of getting over her midlife crisis. Just before the affair is consummated, Mrs. Brody and Hooper are describing each other's sexual fantasies, with Ellen saying that her two big ones are to be a prostitute and to be raped. Describing the former as, quote, every schoolgirl's fantasy, and the latter as standard for women. A few years ago, I would have said that was complete bullshit, but unfortunately we live in a world where this sold over 100 million copies and got a film adaptation, so instead I am reduced to saying mostly bullshit. Next. While he was reading the book in preparation for the film adaptation, Spielberg became determined that while he wanted to preserve the original concept, he found it impossible for him to like any of Benchley's characters. This is perhaps the starkest contrast between book and film. In the former, relations between the shark-hunting trio are very antagonistic. Hooper, who is from the same social circle as Ellen Brody prior to her marriage, is portrayed as a sort of smug college hipster, writing off his two companions as unsophisticated rubes. Quint is civil enough towards Brody, but is contemptuous of Hooper, the soft, effete college boy. For his part, Brody has some respect for Quint, but is also troubled by some of the former's methods. Of particular note is Quint's use of an illegally hunted porpoise as bait. As for Hooper, Brody is overtly hostile towards the younger man throughout their acquaintance, at one point coming close to physically assaulting him. This hostility is of course fueled by the police chief's suspicions of what might be going on between the ichthyologist and his wife. However, Brody never confirms the affair himself, and after Hooper's death decides not to confront his wife about it because what's the point? In the film, with the adultery subplot completely removed from the story, the relationship between Brody and Hooper is far more friendly, and Hooper himself is far more likable. Apart from one brief moment of snobbery at the Brody household,
by cutting the shark open, but you want to let that breathe for nothing.
The film version is otherwise friendly, likable, and eager to help Brody deal with the shark problem. Quint is also far more likable and is friendlier towards his companions in the film, though he does take some of the same shots at Hooper as his book counterpart. For his own part, the Brody of the film is just a simplified version of his book counterpart. A simple, decent man who tries to do the right thing, and as the body count piles up, begins to feel increasingly responsible for the victims' fates. Sure, the three still snap at each other now and again, but for the most part are very friendly together, and you really get a sense of the camaraderie as these three men set out to kill the shark once and for all. But speaking of the shark's victims, in both the book and the film, the shark's second victim is a little boy named Alex Kintner. Also in both versions, there is a subsequent scene where the boy's grieving mother discovers that Brody knew about the shark after the first attack and confronts him about keeping the beaches open. It's the exact same story beats in both versions, but in tone, the difference is night and day. In the book, Mrs. Kintner is basically hysterical, constantly screaming and sobbing, saying how her boy's blood is on Brody's hands and what a sick, evil man he is. It made for some very uncomfortable reading. By contrast, the film version is far more subdued, and frankly, I think it's all the better for it. Apart from that one slap, there's no histrionics, no sobbing. It's just a woman telling Brody that no matter what happens, her son is never coming back. It's very quiet apart from the sea wind in the background, and I think Lee Fierro really nails the performance. The book has a tendency to focus on the melodrama of the various characters in the story, and I think that going for a more subdued tone was a very smart move on Spielberg's part. And this scene is the best example of why I think that's so. Next. Hallelujah. Oh, my friends. If this show ever actually goes anywhere, I guarantee you this will not be the last time you hear me sing the praises of John Williams. At this point in his career, Williams had scored mostly for television, as well as a few early 70s disaster films. Jaws was the second time that John Williams collaborated with Spielberg, the first time being the former's directorial debut, a mostly forgotten crime drama called The Sugarland Express. Williams himself has gone on to say that it was Jaws that launched his career as a film composer, as well as the beginning of the decades-long relationship between him and Spielberg, who in his turn said that without Williams' music, Jaws would only have been half as successful as it was. As just one example of how great this score is, consider the scene where the trio makes their first attempt to kill the shark. Pay attention to the music and how it changes over the course of this less than 2-minute segment of the film.
What were you doing? You knew I had to get a clean shot right in the head. All right, let's see how long that barrel takes to bring him up. Lean on the barrel! I'm coming around again!
I really love that part at the end. The music is cheerful, it's exciting, it's upbeat as they follow the barrel, and then the shark dives, and the music dives with it back into that menacing minor key. Brilliant. But of course, the one track that everyone and their grandmother knows about is the main theme. This is a theme that is so iconic, it has been forever associated with killer sharks and impending danger. And to think that at root, it's nothing but a couple of bass playing a two-note ostinato. What's an ostinato? Well, I had to do a bit of wiki searching for this one, but an ostinato is basically a musical phrase that is repeated over and over and over again in the same pitch. So yeah, John Williams is a musical god, and that alone makes this film worth watching. Next. When it comes to filmmaking, less is more is a commonly used phrase. In the case of Jaws, that mostly refers to the shark. Originally, Spielberg wanted the shark to be in more of the film, but a combination of production conflicts and technical difficulties with the animatronic shark they were using prevented him from doing so. Even though this is the first time I had actually watched Jaws in its entirety, as a layman, I think I have to agree with the critics and film pros on this one. Less really is more. Not only does the shark animatronic look more and more fake the more you see it, but as if to prove the old saying that pressure makes a diamond, Spielberg and co. had to find other ways to make sure that the shark's presence could be felt, even when the shark itself was nowhere to be seen. Which is especially impressive given that we don't get to the actual shark hunt until halfway through the film. The shark book that Chief Brody reads in one scene, to the diagram of a shark in the town hall, the multiple shots that hold on the ocean itself, plus the way the characters talk about the shark, as if it were some kind of boogeyman. All this combines to give you the feeling that this is more than just an animal. This is a presence, a malignant presence looming over everything that the characters do, long before we get on the boat. Considering that this was Spielberg's second directorial effort, and the fact that the production was so hellish that Spielberg himself has referred to this as his crucible, it really is a testament to Spielberg and to the other people that worked on this film that we got a movie as good as this. A film so good that people today point to it and say, why don't they make them like this anymore? And if a newcomer like me is smart enough to see that, either I'm smarter than I thought I was, or more likely, the film is just that good. Next. Like in its source material, suspense is the key to this film. Of course, the way in which that suspense is conveyed to the audience differs. Where in the book, the suspense is carried forward by Peter Benchley's excellent writing, the film is able to use everything from its direction to cinematography to its sound design to the performances of the actors to the use of its soundtrack as a means of conveying the tension. Now, explaining all the various ways in which the film is able to do this exactly would require at least an hour and require me to study several texts on filmmaking and film theory. So instead, I wish to draw your attention to two scenes that, as I watched the film, I thought best exemplified how the film builds suspense and pays it off. So the first scene is aboard the Orca right before their first encounter with the shark. It's a clear day, not much is going on, Brody's trying to do a knot, Quint's just sitting in his chair, and then... See the way that Robert Shaw's attention suddenly focuses on the line. See the way how he stares outwards back towards the ocean. How he slowly and carefully straps himself into his chair in preparation for the tug of war. He's like a hunter sneaking up on a deer, afraid that the slightest mistake will give him away. Absolutely brilliant, and a credit to Robert Shaw's acting in this scene. The tension builds, the music rises, and the payoff.
Hey! I got it!
The second example is the scene where Hooper is examining the deserted boat underwater. Again, this is the first time I'd ever actually watched Jaws. So this is what was going through my head during this scene. Okay, I'm obviously being set up for a scare, so what's it gonna be? What's he gonna find? Is he gonna be a severed hand? A head? A whole leg maybe? Maybe it'll be some poor schmuck bitten in... It got me. It got me even though I knew it was coming. Well played, Spielberg. Well played. Next. It's safe to say that the ending to Jaws the film is perhaps one of the most iconic endings in film history. And while I do still maintain that the book's ending is better in terms of gripping tension and suspense, I do think that the film ending is equally excellent, just in a different way. Both endings emphasize the seemingly unstoppable nature of the shark, smashing Hooper's cage, killing Quint, and single-handedly sinking the boat. Of course, I can't talk about the ending of Jaws the film without mentioning the scuba tank. When screenwriters Carl Gottlieb and Peter Benchley, yes, the original author helped write the script, chose to introduce this plot device into the story, Spielberg understood the importance of making sure that we, the audience, were aware of its significance. Which is why he draws our attention to it at the beginning of the shark hunt.
You screw around with these tanks and they're gonna blow up.
And even throws us a reminder later in the story. So where the book leaves Brody completely defenseless and me on the edge of my seat with fear as the shark closes in for the kill, when I saw Brody shove the tank into the shark's mouth in the film, the tension was still there, but I felt more excitement than fear. And when he finally manages to shoot the tank...
Fire, you son of a...
Shark fin soup for everyone. What a finale. There's nothing more I can really add to that. It's a great ending. Next. You just don't get to be an iconic story without at least one iconic moment. Every great story has them. From Moby Dick's opening line of "Call me Ishmael" to the binary sunset in Star Wars to our first sight of the Citadel in Mass Effect. Jaws 2 has its iconic moments. Moments that everyone talks about. Moments that everyone can recognize even if they haven't seen the film yet. The underwater shots meant to show things from the shark's point of view as it makes its kills. That moment where the camera zooms in on Brody during the second attack and he has that moment of, oh shit, realization. Quint introducing himself by scraping his nails on a chalkboard. The shark's first appearance followed immediately by, you're gonna need a bigger boat. And of course, an ending that pretty much every other killer shark movie since has attempted to rip off. In some ways, it's for moments like these that good stories are told and remembered. To quote one of my favorite YouTubers, Rossatron, how do you make a great killer shark film? You do what Jaws does. The end. And after having finally seen the film, after hearing about how good it was all these years and all the hype surrounding it, I have to say, he's absolutely right. And having read the book, I can understand what it is about this story that made Hollywood decide to make a film adaptation in the first place. Jaws the book is a well-written, gripping story that introduces us to a perfect predator, a creature that embodies both the savagery of nature and the terror of the unknown, as well as the effect it has on the lives of those whose community it threatens. Jaws the movie is one of those rare cases of an adaptation that is truly superior in many ways to its source material. While the story is simplified, it takes three characters that we genuinely care about and pits them against what is arguably the ultimate in cinematic monsters. Even in a day and age where we have truly excellent shark movies like Deep Blue Sea and The Shallows, Jaws remains completely unassailable in its dominance. It is a film that has yet to be surpassed. And no amount of subpar sequels or lousy cash-grabbing ripoffs can change that. In a time when so many fandoms are worried about how the current entertainment industry might mishandle a beloved IP, the success and respect that Jaws has earned proves to me that our favorite stories are more durable than we give them credit for. Jaws is a movie that has survived 4 botched attempts to exploit its name, and like the killer shark itself, it just keeps on swimming, undeterred and seemingly invincible. And I believe that it will continue to do so, as long as there are those who will continue to appreciate it for the great story that it is. And that, more than any other reason, is why we care about Jaws. Was there a reason that you think I missed or should have included? Let me know in the comments below. Like, share, subscribe, and if you have a great story worth telling, come check us out at studiobrainstorm.net, and if you like what you see, contact us. We are always eager to publish new stories. Next week, we'll be leaving the States behind to take on a comic book series quite unlike any other, and a film that defines animation as we know it today. Next time, Akira. Until then.